A light drizzle coated the streets as the mourners gathered at the old cemetery. The air was thick with sorrow, the kind that presses down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. A small group of people, dressed in black, stood in a solemn circle around the freshly dug grave. The priest's voice was soft, steady, offering words of comfort that barely reached the ears of those who needed them the most. But just as he spoke of final goodbyes, a small movement caught everyone's attention. A cat, sleek, black, and completely out of place, strode into the middle of the gathering. It wasn't just passing through. It walked with purpose, as if it belonged there, as if it knew exactly what was happening. It paused at the foot of the grave, sat down, and looked up at the grieving family with its deep, knowing eyes. The murmurs started immediately. Some people exchanged confused glances. Others whispered to one another. But one person, standing just a little apart from the group, gasped softly. That cat, it wasn't a stray. It wasn't just any cat. It was his cat. The man being laid to rest had loved that cat more than anything in the world. But the strange thing was no one had seen it in years. It had vanished one day, just disappeared without a trace. The family had searched, put up flyers, asked neighbors, but the cat was gone. And now, here it was, returning on the very day they were saying goodbye to its owner. The woman closest to the cat knelt down, extending a hand as if afraid the moment would break if she moved too quickly. But the cat didn't run. Instead, it stepped forward, pressing its small head against her fingers, its purr cutting through the silence. A few people gasped. Others wiped away fresh tears. It was as if the cat knew, as if it had come back to say one final goodbye. Hey, if you love stories like this, mysteries, heartwarming moments, things that make you wonder about the world, then make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. We bring you incredible stories that stay with you long after the video ends. And trust me, you don't want to miss the next part of this one. Because here's the thing, this wasn't just a coincidence. This cat's return wasn't random. What happened next would change the way everyone at that funeral saw the world. Because the truth behind this cat's sudden appearance was something no one could have predicted, and it was more heartwarming than anyone could have imagined. The air around the cemetery seemed to change. The rain had slowed to a faint mist, and a hush had fallen over the small crowd. All eyes were on the cat, still sitting calmly at the foot of the grave, its green eyes unblinking. No one spoke for what felt like a long time. It was as if the moment itself was sacred, too delicate to break with words. Then, an older woman took a shaky step forward. Her name was Margaret, the younger sister of the man they were burying. Her hand trembled as she crouched beside the cat, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is it really you?" she murmured, her fingers brushing against its sleek fur. The cat responded by rubbing its head against her hand, a slow, deliberate movement. It purred softly, a sound so familiar it sent a shiver down her spine. She had heard that same sound so many times before, years ago, in her brother's living room. He would sit in his old recliner, the cat curled up in his lap, its steady purring filling the quiet space. But that had been before the cat had disappeared, before her brother had gotten sick, before everything had changed. Margaret turned to her nephew, Daniel, who was standing a few steps behind her. He looked just as shocked as she felt. "It can't be," he said, shaking his head. "This cat's been gone for years." Yet here it was, sitting at his father's grave, as if it had been waiting all this time just for this moment. The priest cleared his throat gently, bringing everyone's attention back to the service. He continued his prayer, but the cat remained where it was, its presence impossible to ignore. Some of the mourners shifted uncomfortably, stealing glances at the animal. Others, like Margaret, found themselves overwhelmed by an emotion they couldn't quite explain. After the service ended, as people began to leave, Margaret and Daniel stayed behind. The cat hadn't moved. It simply sat there watching. The cemetery groundskeeper, a man in his 60s with a kind face, approached them hesitantly. "Strange thing, isn't it?" he said, nodding toward the cat. Margaret exhaled slowly. "You've never seen it before?" The old man shook his head. "Not around here, but I've seen things like this before." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" The groundskeeper gave a small smile. "Animals know things. They feel things we don't. I've seen dogs sit by graves for weeks after their owners pass. I've seen birds return to the same spot year after year. Maybe this cat just knew it was time to come home. The word home lingered in the air, because that's what this was, wasn't it? The cat hadn't just come to a funeral. It had come home. Daniel crouched down, his eyes level with the cat's. "How did you find your way back?" he asked softly, not expecting an answer. The cat just blinked. Margaret sighed, rubbing her temples. "We need to take it home," she said finally. Daniel hesitated. "Are you sure? What if it belongs to someone now?" Margaret looked at the cat, then back at him. "I don't think it does." And deep down, Daniel agreed. They drove back to his father's house, the house where he had grown up. It still smelled the same: old books, coffee, and a faint trace of pipe tobacco. The cat walked in like it had never left, moving through the house with quiet confidence. It went straight to the worn-out recliner in the living room, hopped up, and curled into a familiar ball. Margaret let out a breathless laugh. Unbelievable. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, still trying to process it all. "Do you think Dad knew? Before he passed?" Margaret sat down on the couch, staring at the cat. "I don't know," she admitted. "But maybe he was waiting. Maybe he was holding on, just long enough for this." Neither of them said anything for a while. The weight of the day hung heavily over them. But somehow, with the cat there, the house didn't feel quite so empty. Hey, if you're still watching, make sure to hit that subscribe button. This story is far from over, and you won't believe what happens next. Because the mystery wasn't solved. Not yet. There was still one question lingering in both Margaret and Daniel's minds. Where had the cat been all these years? And what had brought it back now, on this exact day? The truth was coming, but it wasn't what they expected. The house was quieter than usual that night. The kind of quiet that made every small noise feel louder. Every shadow seemed deeper. Margaret and Daniel sat in the living room, the cat curled up on the recliner, its breathing slow and steady. It had made itself at home so effortlessly, as if the years in between had never happened. But for Margaret and Daniel, those years mattered. They weren't just blank spaces. They were years of searching, of unanswered questions. And now, the biggest question of all. Where had the cat been? Margaret sighed, breaking the silence. "I can't stop thinking about it," she admitted. "This can't just be a coincidence." Daniel leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You think someone had it?" She nodded. "Maybe. Or maybe it ran away and survived somehow. But the timing, coming back today of all days, it doesn't feel random." Daniel glanced at the cat, watching the slow rise and fall of its chest. "What if Dad knew?" he said quietly. "What if he saw it before he passed?" Margaret turned to him, eyebrows raised. "You mean, what if the cat came back before today?" He shrugged. "Maybe. We weren't here every day toward the end. What if it came back and he never told us?" Margaret frowned, trying to push through the haze of memories from the last few months. Their father had been getting weaker, speaking less, spending more time sitting in that very chair. He had seemed lost in thought, distant. Had he been waiting for something? Had he been waiting for this? A sudden noise made both of them jump, a soft thump from outside. Daniel stood up quickly, moving toward the window. The porch light flickered in the misty air, barely cutting through the darkness. He couldn't see anything unusual, but something felt off. A presence, maybe an unease that settled into his bones. Margaret watched him carefully. "What is it?" He hesitated. "I don't know." He turned back to the cat, still resting peacefully. But now, its ears were perked, its tail flicking slightly. It was alert, aware, listening. Daniel moved toward the door, opening it just enough to step outside. The cool night air pressed against his skin, and for a moment, everything was still. But then movement, a rustling near the edge of the yard, just beyond the old wooden fence. "Hello," he called out, his voice steadier than he felt. No answer, just silence. He stood there for a long moment before stepping back inside, locking the door behind him. Margaret gave him a questioning look, but he just shook his head. "Probably nothing," he muttered. But he didn't believe that. Not really. The next morning, Daniel woke up to find Margaret in the kitchen, staring at her phone. Her face was pale, her fingers gripping the device tightly. "What's wrong?" he asked, his stomach tightening. She looked up at him, then back at the screen. I was just scrolling through some local news, she said slowly. And I found something weird. She turned the phone around, showing him a post from a community forum. It was a blurry photo of a black cat, their cat, sitting on a stranger's front porch. The caption read, "Has anyone lost a cat? This one has been showing up at my house for weeks. Seems like it's looking for something." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. The post was dated 3 weeks ago. Margaret swallowed hard. That means it was out there. Before today. Before the funeral. Daniel exhaled slowly, trying to piece it together. "It was looking for Dad," he murmured. "It must have been, but where had it been before that? And why had it stayed hidden for so long?" Hey, if you're still with us, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. This story is just getting started, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Because what they discovered next changed everything. The cat hadn't just come back on its own. Someone or something had led it home. And the truth behind it all? That was the real mystery. The weight of the discovery sat between Margaret and Daniel like an invisible force. The cat hadn't just reappeared. It had been looking, searching for something, for someone, their father. But why now? And who had it belonged to all these years? The questions swirled in their minds, but there were no answers. Only eerie coincidences and a feeling deep in their chests that something bigger was at play. Margaret scrolled through the comments under the post. A few people mentioned seeing the cat in different places around town, but one comment stood out. "It's been hanging around near the old library, mostly at night. Weird thing is, it never comes too close. Just sits there watching." Daniel frowned. "Dad loved that library," he said, his voice almost a whisper. Margaret nodded. "Yeah, he used to take us there all the time when we were kids." She hesitated, then looked at him. What if the cat's been waiting for us to notice? The thought sent a shiver through them both. It was too strange to ignore. They had to go. That night, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth as they parked near the library. The street was mostly empty, the building dark except for a faint glow from a single streetlight. It cast long, jagged shadows, making everything feel slightly unreal. They stepped out of the car, the pavement cold beneath their feet. Daniel scanned the area, his pulse quickening. "Do you see anything?" Margaret shook her head. "Not yet." They waited, the silence stretching between them. Then, just as Daniel was about to speak, Margaret grabbed his arm. There, in the dim light, a shadow moved near the steps of the library. At first, it was just a shape, almost blending into the darkness. But then, two glowing eyes lifted toward them. The cat. It sat perfectly still, its gaze locked onto theirs. Watching, waiting. Margaret's breath caught. It knew we'd come. Slowly, they approached, careful not to startle it. The closer they got, the more Daniel's chest tightened. This wasn't normal. It wasn't just a lost pet finding its way home. This felt deliberate. Then, without warning, the cat stood and started walking. Not away from them, but toward the side of the building, toward the alley. Daniel and Margaret exchanged a look. They didn't need to speak. They followed. The cat's tail flicked as it led them deeper into the alley, where the sounds of the town faded away. The air grew colder, the darkness heavier. Then it stopped right in front of an old, rusted metal door. Margaret swallowed. "What is this place?" Daniel reached out, hesitating only for a moment before gripping the handle. It was unlocked. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a narrow stairway leading down into the darkness. The air smelled of dust and something else, something faintly familiar. Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "Daniel, I don't like this." But the cat stepped inside. It didn't hesitate. Daniel looked at Margaret. "We came this far." She exhaled shakily. "Yeah." Together, they stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind them. The cat's soft paws made no sound as it padded down the stairs, leading them into the unknown. And deep in their bones, they knew whatever they found down there would change everything. The air grew heavier as Margaret and Daniel descended the narrow stairs, each step echoing in the silence. The cat moved ahead of them, its tail flicking like a silent guide. A dim light flickered at the bottom, casting long shadows against the damp walls. Neither of them spoke, but their breathing quickened, their minds racing with possibilities. At the base of the stairs, they found themselves in a small, forgotten room. The walls were lined with dusty shelves, filled with books, papers, and old trinkets. In the center of the room sat an old wooden desk, its surface littered with yellowed pages and a single, unlit candle. But it wasn't the desk that made them freeze. It was the picture frame resting on top of it. Margaret stepped closer, her fingers trembling as she reached for it. The moment her eyes met the photo inside, her breath hitched. It was a picture of their father, much younger, smiling, sitting on a bench with an unfamiliar woman. And in her lap, curled up comfortably, was the cat. Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. "No way." Margaret turned the frame over, her pulse pounding in her ears. A handwritten note was scrawled on the back. "Some bonds never break. Some love never leaves." A chill ran down her spine. "Daniel, what is this?" Before he could answer, a sound echoed from the far end of the room. A slow creak, like a door shifting on its hinges. Daniel spun around, his heart hammering. "Did you hear that?" Margaret nodded, gripping the frame tightly. The cat sat near the desk, staring at the darkness beyond the shelves, ears perked. Then something moved. A shadow emerged, shifting just beyond their view. It wasn't just the dim lighting playing tricks on them. Someone was there. Margaret took a step back. "Hello." Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to stay steady. Silence. Then a soft, familiar voice. "You came." Daniel felt a sharp jolt of recognition, though he couldn't place where he'd heard it before. His throat tightened. "Who's there?" A figure stepped into the light, and the sight made Margaret's breath catch. An older woman, her face lined with years of sorrow, stood before them. Her eyes, dark, knowing, shifted from them to the cat. And for the first time since this strange journey began, the cat moved toward someone else. It leapt gracefully into the woman's arms, curling against her like it belonged there. Margaret's grip on the frame tightened. "Who are you?" The woman exhaled, stroking the cat's fur. "I knew one day you'd come looking," she murmured. "I just didn't know if it would be too late." Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Too late for what? The woman looked up, her gaze filled with something unreadable. For the truth, the room felt smaller, the air thicker. Neither Margaret nor Daniel moved, caught between fear and the desperate need for answers. Then the woman turned, walking toward the far wall. She pressed her palm against a section of the bricks, and with a soft click, the wall shifted. A hidden door. The cat jumped down and walked through the opening without hesitation. The woman stepped aside, looking at them expectantly. Margaret's hands felt clammy. "What's back there?" The woman's eyes softened, but her voice carried the weight of something deep, something buried. "The part of your father's story you were never told." Daniel swallowed hard, glancing at Margaret. They had come too far to turn back now. Together, they stepped through the hidden door, unaware that what waited on the other side would change everything they thought they knew about their family and the mysterious cat that had led them here. Margaret and Daniel hesitated for a brief moment before stepping through the hidden doorway. The air beyond was cooler, untouched for years. The cat had already made its way inside, weaving between old furniture draped in dust-covered sheets. The woman followed, her footsteps steady, her presence carrying a quiet authority. The room was larger than they expected. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old records, letters, and journals. In the center stood a small wooden table with an open book resting on it. The woman gestured toward it. "Everything you need to know is in there." Margaret moved first, her fingers hovering over the pages before finally turning one. The handwriting was familiar. She had seen it in childhood birthday cards and old notes tucked into books. It was their father's. Daniel leaned in, scanning the words. The journal was filled with stories, memories, and something else, deep regrets. As they read, the pieces began to fall into place. Their father had loved someone long before he met their mother, a woman named Evelyn. They had planned a life together, but circumstances had pulled them apart. When their father left, he hadn't known that Evelyn was pregnant. She had raised their half-brother in silence, never reaching out, never disrupting the life he had built. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. He never knew? The woman shook her head. Not until much later. By then, he had a family, responsibilities. He wanted to make things right, but he was afraid. He thought reaching out would only bring pain. She glanced at the cat, her expression soft. But he never forgot. Daniel's mind spun. And you? Who are you in all this? The woman smiled faintly. Evelyn's sister. I promised her I'd keep the truth safe until the time was right. Margaret's hands trembled as she turned another page. There was a photograph tucked inside, an old picture of their father holding a newborn, his expression unreadable. On the back, a message in his handwriting. I hope one day you'll understand why I couldn't be there. The weight of the revelation settled over them. Their father had carried this secret for years, a decision made out of fear, regret, and love in its own complicated way. Daniel swallowed hard. So the cat. The woman nodded. It belonged to Evelyn. After she passed, it always found its way back here, as if it knew this was where the past still lived. Margaret looked down at the cat, who now sat at her feet, gazing up with unblinking eyes. Somehow, it had led them here. Had it known? Was it just a coincidence? She wasn't sure, but something about it felt right. A quiet understanding passed between them all. The past couldn't be changed, but the truth had finally found its way home. Margaret exhaled, closing the journal gently. What happens now? The woman gave a small smile. That's up to you. They left the room in silence, the weight of history settling into their hearts. As they stepped back outside, the evening sun cast long shadows across the grass. The funeral had ended. The mourners had gone. Only the quiet remained. The cat trotted ahead, pausing once to look back at them before slipping into the trees. Margaret and Daniel watched it go, neither speaking. Finally, Daniel let out a breath. Dad wasn't perfect, but I think he wanted to do the right thing, in his own way. Margaret nodded. Maybe it's not about whether he made the right choices. Maybe it's about understanding the choices he made. The wind rustled the trees. Somewhere in the distance, the cat's soft meow echoed through the still air before fading into the night.